Welcome to PodAud series of Indian podcasting revolution, where your hosts Roshni and Rohit audit, review, and give a shout out to some noteworthy Indian podcasts.
In this podcast audit, we do not critique the shows, but applaud the efforts of the independent podcasters and suggest improvements.
And not only that, this also gives an opportunity to podcast listeners find great shows to binge on. So listen on and let's jump into today's PodAud. Okay, so this particular episode of PodAud is going to be an interesting one because it is all about people, connections, and conversations. Of course, no brainer here. Every podcast and every podcast conversation is all about that. But whenever you are meeting a person, if you are sitting across them, what intrigues you the most about them? What is it that you look for when you are going ahead to form a connection, a relationship with a person? It can be many things to many people, but for the podcast host, whom we are featuring in this episode today, for her, the uniqueness and individuality of a person is of highest importance. And that's why she started a podcast called You and I, which is an acronym for uniqueness and individuality. I'm talking about the podcast You and I with Rashmi Shetty, which she very beautifully calls a human library. She takes a lot of time, patience, and calmness to talk to her guests who are beautiful people with extraordinary work in their life. It's not just about the designation they hold, it's not about where they come from, but it's all about what work they are doing, what difference they are making in this world. And it's beautiful that Rashmi has chosen podcast and audio as a format to share these stories. So we are auditing and reviewing You and I with Rashmi Shetty in this episode today. Rohit, have you heard this podcast?
Definitely, yes, because it has been a winning podcast, and whoever with the finalist, I happen to listen to those particular podcasts as well. So this was one of that particular podcast which totally blew my mind just because the kind of people they have been hosting onto this particular show, You and I with Rashmi Shetty. I'm totally in love with the kind of people they are because, as you recently said, it was more about the lives of the people, and these are the ordinary people who have the extraordinary lives. So this is something which makes it very special. And I would like to share my thoughts onto this particular podcast because then I have listed it down in a very creative way, whatever I felt good about this show, because then it is more about how we are doing this show. Because it's not just a normal conversation, it is more about the personal blogs, the stories that people haven't heard about. And when we are on social media, there is a common notion that you need some kind of followers, you need kind of a personal brand or something like that. It eventually happens, but at times there are people who are living a great life out there. Their story is worth mentioning, their story is worth sharing, and these are those stories. That is something which I find very intriguing about this particular podcast, because then when you know your purpose, when you know why you are doing this kind of a podcast, it totally establishes the kind of authority that you want to build into the market. That is something, the first point that I would like to highlight, because people started very randomly. If you're not aware of why you are starting, if you're not aware of like what's your passion, what is going to drive to do those number of episodes. Right now we have like more than 100 of episodes with the season 2.
Yeah, more than 100
Yeah,
episodes of this podcast is out.
exactly. And that is something which again takes the kind of a list, because then you have to be delivering value on a consistent basis. So we have seen this has been a weekly show. Rashmi is putting out episodes each week without failing. So whenever you go to a kind of a podcast library or to that particular show, you'll be able to figure it out what kind of episode you want to listen to. So there is not a kind of a missing link out there. So every person will be, yeah.
Exactly. That's a very relevant thing and very important thing for any podcast, that consistency should be maintained. And like you rightly said, that Rashmi has been putting out the episodes consistently week after week, never missing out. And also about the concept, because what makes any show special is the concept. And the way the concept has been developed around this podcast is that it focuses on the journey people have had into what they are doing right now. And she beautifully calls it a human library. And to call a podcast a human library in itself gives a little bit of uniqueness to the podcast and a little bit of authenticity as well. Of course, podcast is a great tool to establish authority and credibility, but I also feel that it is a very powerful tool to share your authenticity. And the way Rashmi creates a very calming, safe space for her guests to share their journeys is remarkable. And for any podcast host who is thinking about starting their show, this is something that they should really, really take care about, which is coming across as an authentic person, coming across truly as who they are, representing who they are, maintaining that consistency, showing up week after week in spite of all the challenges it takes to produce a podcast or come up with episodes every week or even find guests. So Rashmi has a unique way of finding exceptional people through LinkedIn and a website called betterindia.com. So that's very beautiful. And another thing which we highlighted, which is to create a very unique concept around your show. So I think these are the very prominent things that you observe about this particular podcast in the very first instance. But one thing which I also strongly observe about this particular show is that it is a long form of podcast. Episodes very easily go beyond 45 minutes, go beyond 1 hour, which I feel is again a differentiator, because where we are always hearing short form content, people don't have time, less attention span. Amongst all these things, Rashmi has been able to captivate the attention of her listeners in a long form of content as well, solely because the psychographics of a podcast listener is that when they tune into an episode, they are there for a longer form of content. So if I am like going for a gym workout or going for a walk, it is typically 30 to 45 minutes. And I would not like to keep switching episodes during that time. So it gives me a good and long listening experience. That's just my viewpoint with respect to podcast content. I'm always bent towards long form of audio content. But yeah, what about you, Rohit? Your show also is a long form of content, but yeah, your views on that.
Definitely, Roshni, as you shared, what we obviously focus is on the content strategy. So, whatever strategy that you are going to put to your show, that has to work. So, this being kind of an interview show, I have seen like this is one-to-one interview show, and that has been running successfully. So, you just need to have that kind of a trust into your content strategy as well. So, I'll be doing the interview format, I'll be sticking with that particular strategy, and I'll do it for the longest period of time. So people often try to mend their ways. People often try to experiment with their show just because they might not be getting the desired number of downloads or listeners, or they're not able to create that base of the audience. But it is more about bringing in the newer stories, bringing in the kind of episodes that people want to listen. And I have observed this trend with this kind of a podcast. I've seen that Rashmi has been releasing the episode onto the special days as well. So, for example, Autism Day, then National Doctors Day. So, this is a kind of a trend that we can always set with the kind of our podcast if that particular falls into the niche. So, it gives you the kind of a leverage with the kind of trend that is going onto the social media. So, people can utilize it, people can listen to that particular episode just because the enthusiasm with those particular days is quite high. Everyone is talking, so before that episode gets released, you just set the right expectations. Once that is released, people just tune into it, and that stays relevant for say like 4 to 5 days as well. So that is where you have to utilize these trends. People are not following these trends, and this is nicely done with this particular podcast. And with respect to the kind of cohesive and the searchable brand identity that she has created, Rashmi has done a great job out there. What I feel is that, as you said, the episodes are quite long, but if you are just adding the titles in a more clear way rather than just putting the name of the guest, I feel the intro can be cut down to a shorter period of time, and that can be utilized into the episode. So these are the minor things that can be improved with respect to this particular thing, and even the packaging, the cover art and all. So this is something that I feel that could be done with the improvement. And as we do podcasting, as we get involved into it, we often forget to do that branding part. It happened with me as well, like how lately I changed those particular things. But it's part and parcel. It is the process that you have to follow that gets better. But make sure that your content doesn't get lack anywhere. And I have seen, for example, she has hosted Neeta Mhatre Mishra, then Swastika Gurung, Mohammad Wasim. These are the unknown names. So, for example, I know like who is Neeta Mhatre Mishra just because of LinkedIn. But otherwise, if you listen to few of the episodes, people might not be knowing who these people are. So, a title, a kind of a tinge of say like clarity with respect to the title, if they are putting it, then it becomes more interesting for me. So I don't have to read the total description, the total intro. I can just hop onto the episode, and that becomes my kind of a learning experience for me. So over and all, it has been nicely packed with the kind of value that she is delivering through this kind of a podcast, is what I feel.
Awesome, awesome. I love those insights. And I'm sure if Rashmi is listening to these points and inputs, she would definitely integrate them into her podcast. And now let's listen to the trailer episode of You and I with Rashmi Shetty.
The pandemic got us into a reflective space and made us look inward to see what we can do for the world at large. As a self-expression coach, I became a catalyst for women and started Vani, a one-on-one coaching program for women on finding their voice, to speak up, to be visible. As a storyteller, I spotted there were many ordinary people amongst us leading extraordinary lives, making a difference to the world, and they needed to be heard. Thus was born You and I with Rashmi Shetty, where amazing personal journeys with their uniqueness and individuality are showcased. A reaffirmation of the fact, open your eyes wider, the world is far more beautiful when we acknowledge the presence of both you and I.
We hope you will like the podcast we have reviewed on today's PodAud and will head over to it to give it a listen. By the way, if you want your podcast to be audited by us, just fill the application form link in the show notes.
And yes, thank you so much for being here today. Do send us DM on Instagram at TFY Podcast if you follow Indian Podcasting Revolution. And if you are yet to follow, what are you waiting for? Follow it now and join us next week for yet another episode. These are your hosts, Roshni and Rohit, signing off.